You don't get to decide what mail comes onto this street. The board handles all of that now. And frankly, you should be grateful someone finally brought order to this address. That was Delia Brandt, president of the Cedar Hollow Owners Association for the better part of 6 years, standing on my gravel drive in a coral blazer and white sneakers, holding a clipboard like it was a warrant. She was talking about my mailbox at the end of my own driveway, on the 11 acres my wife and I bought and paid for before Delia and her husband ever poured a foundation in that valley. She had decided, somewhere in her head, that the Homeowners Association controlled how the United States Postal Service delivered to my door. What she did not know, standing there so sure of herself, was that I had spent 26 years carrying a federal badge for the Postal Inspection Service, and that the man who would eventually sit across a table from her and read her own forms back to her had trained under me. She thought she was scolding a tired old rancher. She was talking to someone who had put people in federal prison for doing exactly what she had already started doing. If a woman with a clipboard told you the mail on your own land was now hers to manage, what would you have done? Would you have argued on the driveway? Filed a complaint nobody would read? I want you to hold your answer while I tell you how this actually went, because the way it ended surprised even me. My name is Walter Boyd. I am 63 years old. For most of my working life, I was a federal postal inspector, which is a job most people have never heard of and which is, in plain terms, a law enforcement officer who investigates crimes involving the mail. Mail theft, mail fraud, identity schemes that move letters and money through the postal system. I carried a badge and a gun and a caseload, and I learned to build a thing slowly and let it stand on its own weight. I retired 6 years ago to the property my late wife Ruth and I had bought back when the valley was nothing but pasture and a single county road that flooded every spring. 11 acres at the end of Hollow Run, with a log house I helped raise board by board and a barn that still smells like the hay Ruth used to stack in the loft against my objections that she was too small to be up a ladder with a bale. She passed 4 years ago, in the spring, and the land has felt half empty since. Our granddaughter Maddie lives with me now, 16 years old, sharp as a tack and twice as quick. And she is the reason I get up in the morning and the reason I was never once tempted to just sell the place and let Delia win. I keep records. I always have. It is not a hobby. It is a habit beaten into me across a career where a case lived or died on, whether you wrote it down the day it happened. I have a manila folder for everything, the kind with the little tab you write on with a felt pen, and I keep them in a green steel cabinet in the room off the kitchen that Ruth used to call my den, and I always called the office. A legal pad sits by the kitchen phone, the same brand I have bought for 30 years, and a coffee can full of pens beside it. 2 cheap cameras hang over the gate that save to a card and to a drive in the house. Because in my old life, I learned that one copy is no copy. When something happens on my land, I write the date, the time, the weather, and what I saw, and then I file it. I do it the day it happens, not the day after, because memory is a liar that gets more confident the longer you wait. Ruth used to laugh at me for it. She would come in and find me at 10 at night, writing down the time the propane truck came, and she would shake her head and say, "Walter, the propane man is not going to take you to court." I would tell her, "You never know who is going to take you to court." And she would kiss the top of my head and go to bed. She is not laughing now, wherever she is, because that habit is the only reason I am telling you a story with a happy ending instead of a sad one. Every time I opened that green cabinet this past year, I thought of her standing in the doorway with that look on her face, and I kept writing anyway. And now I am glad past saying that I did. The trouble started small, the way these things do. Cedar Hollow was a development that grew up across the county road from my place about 9 years back. Delia's husband, Roy Brandt, was the man behind it. He ran the company that bought the old Hutchins pasture, cut it into lots, strung up a gate with a stone sign, and called it an estate community. Delia made herself president of the Owners Association the first year and never let go. For a while, they left me alone. I was outside their gate, outside their plat, outside their authority in every way that mattered. My deed predated their development by 3 decades. My mailbox had stood at the end of my drive since before their stone sign existed. Then came the day the mail stopped. It was a Tuesday in the spring, and I noticed it the way you notice a clock that has gone quiet. No catalog, no bank statement, no card from my sister in Tulsa, who still writes by hand and always has, even now when everybody her age has gone to email. I figured it was a slow week. Mail runs thin sometimes, especially out at the end of a county road where the carrier has to make a special turn just for you. The next Tuesday, it was the same. Empty box, the little red flag down where I had left it, the gravel around the post undisturbed. By the 3rd week, the quiet had a shape to it, and the shape was wrong. So I drove into town to the post office and stood at the counter and asked the clerk, a young woman named Paige with a steady way about her, whether something had happened to my route. She looked at her screen for a long moment. Her fingers stopped on the keys. Then she looked at me with an expression I would come to know well over the next year. The expression of a person who has found something they cannot explain and do not want to be blamed for. She told me my mail was being held. Held where? I asked. She said the system showed a forwarding order on my address, a change of address request, submitted by mail, routing my delivery to a community mailbox cluster inside the Cedar Hollow gate, to be sorted and distributed by the association office. I kept my voice level. I asked her who submitted it. She turned the screen a few inches toward herself, like she did not want me reading it, and said the form did not require an in-person signature when it came in by mail, and that the signature on file read W. Boyd. I had not signed any such form. I told her so plainly, the way you tell a clerk a fact and not an accusation. Paige bit the inside of her cheek. She said she could see the order, but she could not undo it from her counter, that it had come through processing and would need a formal correction. She wrote my name and number on a slip, told me she would flag it for the postmaster, and said someone would look into it. I thanked her. None of this was her doing, and I have never once raised my voice at a clerk who was only telling me what the screen said. That was the first entry in the folder. Tuesday the date, fair and cool. Mail held against a forwarding order I never signed. One incident. I want you to remember that number, because by the end, there were a great many of them. Now, I knew something Paige did not. I knew that a forwarding order filed in another person's name to divert their mail is not a paperwork mix-up. It is a federal crime. Filing a false change of address to obtain or interfere with someone else's mail violates federal law in at least 2 ways I could name without looking them up. I also knew, from 26 years of doing the work, that knowing a crime has occurred and proving who did it are 2 very different mountains. So I did not drive over to the Cedar Hollow gate and shout. I went home and started building a case the way I had built 100 before. The next morning, I called the Postal Inspection Service field office that covered our region. I did not use any old connections. I did not call anybody's cell phone or trade on a name. I called the public line like any citizen, sat on hold with the recording for 11 minutes, gave my complaint, and got a case reference number, which I wrote on the legal pad and then on the folder tab. A young inspector took my statement. He was thorough, asked good questions, made me spell the street name twice. When I gave my full name, there was a pause on the line, a long one, and then he said, with real care in his voice, that he would handle this one himself. His name was Daniel Cho. Years ago, when he was new and green and so nervous on his first fraud case that he had spilled coffee on the file twice in one night, I had been the senior inspector who sat with him at a gray government desk until past midnight, teaching him how to read a mail cover and how to build a timeline a prosecutor could hold in one hand. He had not forgotten. Neither had I. I told him to treat me like any complainant, build it clean, and let the evidence carry it. Because a case that leans on a friendship is a case a defense attorney takes apart in an afternoon. He went quiet. Then he said, "You taught me that one too." He told me to document everything, to keep originals, to never confront anyone in a way that could be turned into a counter-complaint, and to file a formal request for my own mail records so the paper trail came from the system and not from my memory. So I did, that same week, in writing, certified, with a copy for the folder. A week later, Delia Brandt came to my driveway in person for the first time. And that is when I learned the held mail was not an accident. She got out of a white luxury SUV with a vanity plate that read HO Queen, which I am not making up and could not have invented. She had the coral blazer, the clipboard, the pushed-up sunglasses sitting on her hair like a tiara. She told me the association had implemented a centralized mail program for the safety and aesthetic harmony of the community, and that my address fell within the service area. I told her my address fell within my deed, which sat a quarter-mile outside her gate. She smiled the way people smile when they have decided you do not matter, and said, "Walter, the valley is functionally part of our jurisdiction now. The post office agrees. Your mail comes to our office, and you can pick it up during posted hours with proper identification." Proper identification. To collect my own mail. On my own road. I did not raise my voice. I asked her one question. I asked whether she had signed a form with my name on it. Her face did something then, a small tightening at the mouth. And she said the program was handled by the management company, and she did not concern herself with paperwork. Then she got back in her SUV and drove off, gravel ticking against her wheel wells. I stood in my drive and watched her go, and I felt the old thing settle into my chest, the cold, patient anger that had served me well for 26 years. Then I went inside and wrote it down. Date, time, the plate, the quote, word for word. 2 incidents now, and the second one had her voice on it. Maddie was at the kitchen table doing homework when I came in. She had heard the SUV. She asked if it was the HOA lady again. I said it was. She frowned and said, "Grandpa, isn't messing with somebody's mail like a federal thing?" 16 years old, and she had cut straight to the center of it. I told her it was, and that we were going to do this the right way. And she nodded and went and got the second camera card from the gate and handed it to me without being asked. I copied it to the drive that night. That is the kind of help she gave me through the whole long year, quiet and exactly right. What followed was a staircase, and I am going to walk you up it the way I climbed it, one step at a time, because the count is the whole point. The first month, my mail was simply held at the Cedar Hollow office. When I drove over and asked for it, the gate guard waved me through with a look like he had been told to expect me. And a young woman at the management desk handed me a thin stack and slid a clipboard across the counter and made me sign a log to receive my own correspondence. I signed it. I did not argue with a 25-year-old who was only doing what her manager told her. I did keep my copy of what they gave me, photographed the log with my phone before I left, and noted what was missing against what I knew should have come. My sister's letters never came. The seed catalog never came. A renewal notice for my truck registration never came, and I only learned that it had been mailed and intercepted when a deputy pulled me over for an expired tag on the highway in the fall. A small humiliation that cost me $40 and a morning standing on the shoulder of the road while traffic slowed to look. I filed that too, the citation and the date and the reason it happened. 3 incidents, then 4, then 5, each one written down the day it happened. Each one a brick. I did not yet know the shape of the wall I was building. By summer, it had gotten worse. Delia sent me what she called a notice of non-compliance, printed on heavy association letterhead with a little embossed seal she must have ordered special, claiming my mailbox at the end of my drive violated a community standard and would need to be removed within 30 days. My mailbox. A quarter-mile outside her gate, on a post Ruth and I had set the first summer we owned the place. I read it twice at the kitchen table, then I photographed it, filed the original in a plastic sleeve, and mailed Inspector Cho a copy with the date noted on the back. That was a mistake on her part, though she did not know it yet, because a written claim of authority over my mail, signed by her in her own hand, was exactly the kind of thing a federal case is built on. People who do these things almost always overreach onto paper eventually. They cannot help it. The authority feels too good not to put in writing. 6 incidents. In August, she escalated again. I run a small side business out of my barn, restoring old tractor engines for folks around the county, the kind of slow, careful work that suits a man who likes his hands busy and his evenings quiet. The parts I order come through the mail and through freight, and the payments my customers send me come through the mail too. Checks folded into envelopes the old-fashioned way, because my customers are mostly men my age who do not trust a phone to move money. That month, 3 of those customers told me their checks to me had bounced back to them marked undeliverable, returned by the Cedar Hollow office as addressed to a location outside the service area. She was now reaching past me and into my livelihood, intercepting business mail, costing me work and costing my customers their patience. One of those customers was a rancher named Earl Sutton, 70 years old, who had been bringing me engines for 15 years and who does not waste a word he does not mean. Earl drove out to my place in his old flatbed, mad as a hornet, and got out holding his returned envelope up like a fish he meant to throw back. "Walt," he said, "what in the world is going on with your address? I wrote that check 3 weeks ago and it come back to me with a stamp on it says, you don't live where you've lived for 30 years. I sat him down at the kitchen table and told him the whole of it, the held mail, the forwarding order I never signed, the woman in the coral blazer. Earl listened with his jaw working. Then he said, "You want me to put that in writing?" I said it would help. He said, "Get me a pen." He wrote it out that afternoon in his blocky, careful hand, what he had sent, when and how it came back, and he signed it and dated it, while Maddie poured him coffee, and he thanked her by name. That affidavit went into the folder in its own plastic sleeve. 7 incidents, and now I had an independent witness with nothing to gain and a returned envelope with a Cedar Hollow stamp on it to back him up. Around then, I started to understand the why of it, which up to that point had only been a guess sitting in the back of my mind. Roy Brandt's development had stalled. I heard it first from Earl, who heard it at the feed store the way a man hears everything that matters in a county that size. And then I confirmed it myself by driving to the county building and pulling the records, which are public and which I knew how to read because reading records had been half my job for a quarter century. Cedar Hollow had platted a second phase, 20-some lots up the slope. And that phase needed a new access road. And the only sensible route for that road ran across the southern edge of my 11 acres, along an old easement that had been written into the deeds back in the pasture days and had quietly lapsed years before for non-use. Roy needed my land, or at least a strip of it 40 feet wide, or his second phase was just lines on a map. And Delia, it seemed, had done the arithmetic that the cheapest way to get a 40-foot strip from a stubborn old widower was not to buy it, which I would have refused, but to make his daily life small and tiring and uncertain until he gave up, sold cheap, and moved to a condominium in town where the mail comes to a wall of little brass doors. Nobody fights about anything. The mail was the pressure. The pressure was the plan. She had picked the one thing that touches a person every single day. The thin daily thread that connects a man at the end of a county road to his sister and his bank and his customers and his government. And she had cut it, thinking a frayed enough thread would move me. I did not say any of this out loud to anyone but Cho, because a theory is not evidence, and I had learned long ago not to confuse the two. I wrote down only what I could prove: the public plat, the lapsed easement, the stalled phase, and I let the rest of it sit quiet in my chest where it kept the cold, patient anger company. Inspector Cho called me in the fall. He told me, in the careful, neutral way of a man building something solid, that a forwarding order filed without authorization was enough to open a formal investigation, but that to bring a charge that would stick, he needed a clear pattern, ideally with the association's own records showing they knew the address was outside any legitimate service area and rerouted it anyway. He named a number. He said if I could document a sustained pattern of interception over a period of months, paired with their own written claims of authority, the case would be strong. That turned my year from an endurance test into a countdown. Every held letter, every returned check, every notice on her letterhead was now a brick in a wall I was building on purpose. So I kept climbing the staircase. On a clear, cold Wednesday in October, a man I had never seen showed up at my gate in a navy polo shirt and a lanyard with a laminated card, calling himself a community compliance officer, and told me he was there to inspect my mailbox for removal. He had a clipboard and a tone and a little aluminum case and absolutely no authority of any kind. I came down the drive with my coffee mug in my hand and stood on my side of the gate and looked at him for a while before I said anything. Then I asked him, polite as church, to show me the badge his card was pretending to be. He turned the laminated card around to face me, a printed thing with a clip art eagle on it, and said the association issued its own credentials. I asked which agency. He said the association. I asked him to spell community compliance officer for me so I could write it down correctly. And I took out my legal pad and clicked my pen, and that was when his tone left him. He could not produce a real badge because no such thing existed, and he could not stand being written down. I photographed him and his clip art card in his little case, noted the time and the temperature, and watched him drive back toward the gate. 8 incidents, and now I had a photograph of a man impersonating an official on my own property. In November, Delia called the sheriff on me. She reported that I was harassing her management staff and refusing to comply with community mail policy. A deputy named Sam Reyes drove out to my place on a cold gray morning with frost still on the pasture, parked behind my truck, and came up the drive with his thumbs in his belt and the look of a man who would rather be anywhere else. He was polite and tired and clearly did not want to be there. He told me he had to respond to the complaint because a complaint had been filed, that the law obligated him to come out and take a statement whether or not the complaint had any merit to it. I told him I understood that better than he might think, that I had spent my whole career on the other side of exactly that obligation, rolling on complaints I knew were thin because the badge does not get to pick. He tilted his head at that and said, "You were on the job." I said, 26 years, federal postal. He raised an eyebrow, and some of the tiredness went out of his posture. I asked him to come inside out of the cold, and I showed him my folder. Not all of it. just the spine of it, laid out on the kitchen table in order the way I would have laid it out for a prosecutor. The held mail log with my forced signature. The forwarding order I never signed. The notice on her letterhead claiming authority over my box. Earl's affidavit and his returned envelope. The photograph of the man with the clip art badge. Deputy Reyes went quiet as he turned the pages, and the quiet got longer the further he got. Then he looked up and said, "Mr. Boyd, this is not a code dispute, and it is not a neighbor squabble. This is mail. You need a postal inspector." I told him one was already on it and gave him Cho's name and the case number, and he wrote both down in his own notebook. Before he left, he stood on the porch a moment and said, off the record, that he had taken 3 separate complaints from the Brents about 3 different neighbors that year, and that mine was the first one that came with a folder like this. Then he said, "Keep doing what you're doing." 9 incidents, and the first clean crack of an officer beginning to pivot. Through all of it, I kept Maddie close and kept her steady, because a 16-year-old should not have to learn that an adult will lie with a smile, and she was learning it anyway. One evening in early December, she came in from feeding the barn cat at the gate shaking, and not from the cold, and told me a car had slowed at the end of the drive, and somebody had gotten out and taken our actual mailbox clean off its post and thrown it in the ditch. "Just gone," she said. The post snapped, our name on the side of it down in the weeds. I sat her at the table and got her hands around a warm mug and held her by the shoulders until her breathing came back down to where it should be. I told her she did exactly right coming straight inside, and that nobody was going to touch her, and that this was the kind of thing that finishes a person like Delia rather than the kind that wins. Then I went out with a flashlight in the dark and the cold, and I did the work. I photographed the snapped post where it stood. I photographed the box down in the ditch with our names showing. I recovered it, set it on the porch, and pulled the camera card from the gate. The footage showed the white SUV slowing on the county road, a figure getting out and crossing to the post, and the box coming off it in 2 hard motions. The plate was not readable in the dark, and I noted that honestly, because a record you shade is a record you cannot use. The vehicle itself was unmistakable, and the timestamp was clean, and the height and build of the figure were there to be measured. I did not sleep much that night. In the morning, I called Cho and uploaded the footage to him directly through the channel he had set up. Destroying or tearing down a receptacle approved for the mail is its own federal violation, separate from everything else. And now it was on video with a timestamp. 10 incidents, and the staircase had finally crossed from petty into plainly criminal in a way that no lawyer alive could argue around. That was the turn. After the mailbox, Cho stopped saying if and started saying when. He spent the winter doing the patient work I knew so well, the work that never shows up in the dramatic version of these stories, and that is, in truth, the only part that ever wins them. He pulled the original forwarding order and had the signature examined by an examiner who does nothing but compare handwriting, and she found what I already knew, that the W. Boyd on that form had never been written by my hand. He subpoenaed the management company's records, all of them, the emails and the work orders and the internal notes. And somewhere in that stack, he found the thing that ends people. He found an email from Delia herself, sent to the office manager, instructing the staff to reroute, hold, and return all mail addressed to my parcel until further notice. And in that same email, she had written a line that I will remember until the day they put me in the ground. A line in which she said the point was to make the old man tired enough to deal. Tired enough to deal. She had put her whole plan into one sentence and pressed send. And the system had kept it the way the system keeps everything, patient and dumb and permanent. He documented more. He found that the Postal Service had told the association in writing, not once, but twice. That my address sat outside any cluster service area and could not be lawfully rerouted to their office, and that the association had read those letters and continued anyway. He built it the way I had taught him at that gray desk all those years ago, brick on brick, dated and sourced and dull as ledger paper, the kind of case that does not thrill a jury, but does not lose either. And every brick he laid that winter was a brick I had handed him across my kitchen table over the preceding year, without ever once knowing which one would turn out to be the cornerstone. That is the thing about keeping records. You do not get to know in advance which scrap saves you. You just keep them all. The reveal did not happen on my driveway. It happened where it should, in a public room, in front of people, with a neutral authority holding the document. The county had scheduled a hearing on Cedar Hollow's second phase access road, the road Roy needed across my land, and the chamber was full. Delia was there in a fresh blazer, Roy beside her in a sport coat, their lawyer with a leather folio. They were there to ask the county to grant the easement across the southern edge of my property. I was there because it was my land. And Inspector Daniel Cho was there in a dark suit with a badge on his belt and a folder of his own. When the chairman opened the floor, Delia stood and made her case, smooth and rehearsed, about community planning and shared infrastructure and how my parcel was, in her words, functionally part of the Cedar Hollow community already. The same phrase. The third time I had heard her say a version of it, now into a microphone, on the record, in front of the county. Then Cho stood. He did not raise his voice. He introduced himself, his title, and his badge number, and asked the chairman for 2 minutes. He laid one sheet on the table in front of the board. It was the forwarding order. He said the signature on it, purporting to be mine, had been examined and was not mine. He laid down a second sheet, the Postal Service notice telling the association my address could not be rerouted. He laid down a third, Delia's own email instructing her office to reroute, hold, and return my mail. He said the words quietly into the silent room, filing a false change of address to divert another person's mail, obstruction of correspondence, destruction of a mail receptacle, federal offenses, everyone, and the investigation was complete. The room went still. I have been in a lot of quiet rooms in my life, the particular quiet that falls in the second right after a person realizes the thing they were certain of has come apart in their hands. I have watched it happen across an interview table more times than I can count. This was the deepest one I ever heard. Nobody coughed. Nobody shifted in a chair. Delia stood at the microphone with her mouth slightly open and no words coming out of it, and the rehearsed smoothness drained out of her face one feature at a time. And Roy looked at the table in front of him as if the wood grain might offer him a way out, and it did not. Delia's lawyer started to speak, and Cho turned to him and said one sentence. He said the United States had already presented the matter to the office that files such charges, and that this hearing was not the venue to argue it. Then he looked at Delia, and he said, for the record, that interfering with the mail of a retired federal postal inspector had a way of getting noticed quickly, and that her own emails had made the case for him. That was the only time my old job came up. He did not need it. The paper had already won. It had won months earlier, the day she sent the first instruction in writing, and the day she signed her name to a notice claiming authority she never had. Here are the two numbers I want you to hold side by side. Across 1 year, the Cedar Hollow Association intercepted, held, returned, or destroyed my mail across 10 documented incidents, and not one of them was lawful. Across that same year, I collected 0 fines, paid 0 settlements, and signed 0 forms surrendering 1 inch of my land, because there was nothing they could lawfully make me do. 10 unlawful acts on her side, 0 concessions on mine. That was the whole arithmetic of it. The county tabled the access road that night and never brought it back. Without the road, the second phase of Cedar Hollow could not be built, and the development that had already stalled simply stopped where it stood, a handful of staked lots growing weeds up the slope. Roy's company folded the following year under the weight of the lots it could not finish and the loans it could not service. And the stone sign at the gate went gray and streaked because there was no longer anyone whose job it was to wash it. Delia was charged. She pleaded to the obstruction of correspondence count and the false forwarding order, paid a federal fine that dwarfed by many times anything she had ever tried to levy on a neighbor over a mailbox or a fence or a shade of paint, served a period of probation, and was barred from holding any postal authority, which is a thing that does not technically exist and which she had invented for herself in the first place out of a clip art eagle and a coral blazer. She lost, specifically and exactly, the thing she had reached for. She had wanted my road across my land. She lost her own road, her husband's company, and the title she had held for 6 years. All of it the direct and automatic consequence of her own emails, in her own words, kept by the same system she had tried to bend. The morning after the hearing, I drove into town to the post office. Paige was at the counter. She slid my mail across without a word, a real stack of it. 3 weeks of my sister's handwriting and a truck registration renewal and a seed catalog. And she smiled at me, and I thanked her. And I drove home with it on the seat beside me like it was treasure. Because in a way, it was. Maddie helped me set a new mailbox at the end of the drive that weekend. We sank the post in concrete this time, deeper than it needed to be, deep enough that no slow car in the dark would ever take it off again. And she mixed the bag herself and watched it set. Then she painted our name on the side in white letters, careful and even, her tongue between her teeth the way Ruth's used to go when she concentrated. When we were done, she stood back in the cold sunlight and looked at it for a long moment and said, "Grandma would have liked that we didn't move." I had to look at the fence line for a minute before I could answer her. Ruth would have liked it. She would have liked that we kept the land and kept our name out on the road where anybody could read it, and did the whole of it without ever once raising our voices. So here is the lesson, plain as I can make it, from a man who spent his life on the other side of these cases. If something is wrong, do not argue it on your driveway. Write it down. Date it, time it, keep the original, and put a copy somewhere else. If it touches your mail, understand that the mail is federal, and that a postal inspector is a real person with a real phone number who investigates real crimes, and call them. Pull your own deed and read it against the ground. Pull the public records because they are public for a reason. Talk to your neighbors because the one harassing you is almost never harassing only you. And keep your records the way you would keep a promise, because the day comes when a quiet folder on a kitchen table outweighs every loud voice in the county. If you have had a clipboard tell you something on your own land that you knew in your gut was not true, tell me about it in the comments, because I read them and I learned from them. Subscribe if you want to hear how these turn out, because the records always tell. And next time, I will tell you about the widow 2 counties over whose HOA tried to charge her for the rainwater that fell on her own roof, and how a 100-year-old water decree in a courthouse basement ended that argument in about 90 seconds. Keep your folder. Walk your line. I will see you next time.